Second episode of Kan Bonim, the season opener for the three leading Israeli teams, and this time we're focusing more on the forwards and centers that Hapoel Tel Aviv, Maccabi Tel Aviv and Hapoel Jerusalem have brought in. A reminder for anyone who hasn't seen the first episode.
These episodes are currently focusing on the top 3 teams because I have the rights to the EuroLeague and EuroCup that they play in, so I can show a lot more visual content and talk much more about visual things that are easier to discuss and analyze, and that's why I'm not covering all the team. Because unfortunately I don't have the time or the ability to go over all the teams and all the new signings in the Israeli Premier League. And for anyone who missed it, the first episode is on the channel where I talked about the guards. So let's get started. And this time, instead of an opening, I'm going to use 9 seconds to tell you that this year we're going to release a EuroLeague fantasy game on 9 Fantasy, so check it out at the link at the end of the video. Like in the previous video, we'll start with Hapoel Tel Aviv and begin with Zach Ledei, who in my opinion is a signing that, let's say, all of Europe is looking for this kind of player. Simply because in a way, he's a bit of a unicorn in today's basketball.
There aren't many players who play the 4 and shoot 3s as well and as consistently as he does.
43.7% career in the EuroLeague. Over 226 games. That's not something you can underestimate or take lightly. But it's not just the shooting. He's a very efficient player on offense, he's an incredible offensive weapon, he has excellent touch around the rim. Hapoel fans will really enjoy that one-handed touch he loves to use, those shots from the paint area when defenders come to him and pay attention to him, when they close out on him and focus on him. Because he shoots at a high enough percentage that it's too dangerous to leave him open. In my opinion, Zach Ledei is the kind of player whose impact isn't measured only by what he does on the court. When I say that, I don't just mean his raw stats, not just his shooting ability, but everything he brings to the game. And that's an efficient player. Really a player like no other. Of course, he has his weaknesses, but his weaknesses are actually the strengths of Hapoel Tel Aviv when it comes to creating plays. Because usually he doesn't create much for himself, and even when he does, it's not necessarily an offense that he initiates, but rather it's through the flow, through the guards who create for him, ball movement and so on. And when they go to him for post-ups, he can occasionally score here and there, right? He still does it effectively. He can do that too, but usually it's just for a few plays during the game, once or twice, not more than that. In short, he's a player that I've personally really liked for years, in my opinion. Top EuroLeague, top in terms of fit as well. He really can bring a lot to a table. But we also need to talk about the defensive side, because on one hand, yes, he'll have some plays where we'll see him flying and blocking shots from time to time. Here I put together for you some highlights where he jumps nicely and blocks players he's guarding one-on-one, or comes as a help defender, and as you know, I really like him, but that's not the strongest part of his game. In the last 2 years he played in Milano, but at least in terms of numbers and efficiency, you can't blame him for that. 16 points in 24-25. 13 last year, almost 50% from 3 last year, and 46.2 the year before. That. He's also an excellent free throw shooter and goes to the line relatively often, almost 4 times per game on average. 4.5 rebounds per game on average for a player who plays at the power forward position, along with the fact that he doesn't lose effectiveness often, that's the name of the game. There aren't many players like that among top EuroLeague power forward. We move on from the forward who is perhaps the most proven and experienced you can bring at the EuroLeague level to 2 new unproven forwards. The first is Amir Kofi, who comes with 7 years of NBA experience, who, as always with a player coming from the NBA, especially after so many years and when he's not a kid, he's 29 years old, he comes with question marks. But one thing that's an exclamation point about Amir Kofi is his ability to shoot, catch and shoot shots. Because that's what we've seen him do pretty much his entire career. He was never the go-to guy on his team, and he won't be in Europe either. The thing with players like this, after so many years playing in the NBA in a certain role, you can't expect them to play a different role when they come back to Europe, or expect them to do something out of the ordinary. But to be honest, that's probably exactly what Hapoel needs and will ask from him. To be the one who hits the catch and shoot shots, does the catch and drive, and finishes effectively with 1 or 2 dribbles, and that's something he's had throughout his career. Also the mid-range and the ability to finish, especially when he's not up against the opposing team's main defender. That's what kept him in the league and made him an asset for so many years, because if you look at his weaknesses as a player, you see him at the 3 position. He does give you the scoring you need, but he's problematic when it comes to rebounds. As a rebounder, he's significantly below average, and defensively, when you measure his effectiveness over 7 years in the NBA, he's a bit below average. Again, it's nothing out of the ordinary. And personally, I would be more concerned about his rebounding and making sure there are good rebounders on the court. And Hapoel Tel Aviv has that at every position, even at the point guard spot with Satoransky, more than his shooting or his defense. I don't think it will be that much of a problem at the European level. Mainly, by the way, because the court is more crowded. And I think what kept him in the NBA over the years, besides the fact that he's a good shooter, because there are a lot of good shooters, is the fact that he's a good teammate. That he's a team player who knew how to fit into a lot of systems, and more of a player who does what's asked of him. The one who might complement him at the forward position, and I say might because I really don't know, there's not too much data about him, is Jacob Toppin, Obi Toppin's brother, a 26-year-old forward. The truth is, it's a bit hard to gauge exactly where he stands and how good he'll be at the European level. He looks like an excellent athlete like his brother, but there's not enough data on him from playing in the NBA, because he really played a very limited number of minutes in a very limited number of games. So talking about his stats from there is misleading, because maybe he shot 42%, but that's 11 out of 24, and that's a very small sample size, and he's probably the biggest question mark here on the roster, but in a positive way. At the end of the day, this is a player who wasn't on an NBA roster for nothing, and he's also trying to find his place in Europe and isn't supposed to come in with any star attitude. He doesn't have a place in the NBA, so he looked for a team in Europe. And the one thing I can say about him for sure is that he's an excellent rebounder, both on offense and defense. Simply because his rebounding rate has been very strong throughout his entire career, on every team and everywhere he's played, relative to the amount of minutes he's had, of course. So his stats from the G League are maybe something you can look at and use as some kind of benchmark, but we all know you have to take the G League with a grain of salt, because it's a different level and a completely different style of play than what he'll see in Europe. He's effective from the field, effective from three, a good rebounder, but like I said, it won't necessarily translate to European basketball, and most likely he'll have a role somewhere between Ish Wainwright and Kofi, until they figure out exactly what his position and status are on the team. So the risk with Hapoel Tel Aviv, when I look at the roster, you can still say, I see people still saying, they're missing another center. They have Otu and Diasa continuing from last season, Itai Segev as the third center. You can always say something is missing. I don't think this team is missing anything right now, and at least in my opinion, when I look at the roster, its versatility, its quality, the experience it has, this is a team that should finish in the top 4, in my eyes. I want to remind you that in the end, in the EuroLeague and in basketball in general, the transfer market is so open that you can bring in players even in a month, 2 months, 3 or 4 months if necessary. It's not like this is a closed roster that you run with for an entire season. We all know how it works in basketball. But in terms of Hapoel Tel Aviv's roster, this is a top 4 team in my eyes. I think they should set a completely realistic goal for themselves to reach the Final Four. Maybe the Greek teams, there's no doubt they're on a level of their own, they're better, and I would say Fenerbahce, Real Madrid, you can argue about that. So, top 4 or 5. Beyond that, I don't see a roster as strong as Hapoel Tel Aviv's. If they were playing in Israel, I believe they'd have another significant advantage as well. I wish and I hope it will come back, but right now I think that aiming for the Final Four is a completely realistic goal for them, especially with the amount of money and the quality of players they've invested in. And from here we move on to their city rival Maccabi Tel Aviv, which, contrary to what I said in the previous video in the first episode, I think one of their biggest strengths, before I even talk about the players who joined, is the players who stayed. The fact that they kept Horde, Brist, Sorkin of course, PJ Leaf, and even Will Rayman, who despite all his shortcomings, brings unique qualities and has a role on a EuroLeague team. Along with them there's Gur Lavi, and they added Bonzi Colson, a player who knows the system, played for Maccabi Tel Aviv, and you could actually say he blossomed at a EuroLeague level with Maccabi Tel Aviv. In the last 2 years after he left Maccabi, he experienced a bit of a drop in his stats, but that drop wasn't because he became a worse player, it was simply because he had a smaller role at Fenerbahce, which is a top European team, very very deep, and he simply played there an average of 10 minutes less per game. But that doesn't mean he was less effective. He was actually even more effective last season, and I think he brings something very very special here. I really like him as a player. I think first of all, he is a player who's almost always fit, plays tough, shoots well, plays well off the ball, and most importantly, he's a true two-way player. You know exactly what you're getting from him offensively, but also defensively, and I think one of his biggest advantages, and you could see this during his previous time at Maccabi Tel Aviv when he played together with Sorkin, that he's not a good defensive rebounder, and Colson really makes up for it. There was a period when Sorkin played at the 5, and Colson played at the 4. And Colson is actually more of a 3 than a 4. But in small ball lineups, he can also play the 4. He's an excellent rebounder, and he can cover for a lot of other players when it comes to rebounding, thanks to his long wingspan. And he's an excellent defender. Add to that the fact, like I said, that he knows the system at Maccabi Tel Aviv, and is loved by the fans and so on. It's a win-win situation. I don't see any reason why Maccabi Tel Aviv shouldn't have brought him back. In my opinion, it's an excellent signing for them, and I think that just pairing him together with Brist and Horde gives you 3 forwards who are very very different in their essence and in what they actually bring to the table, and also in the areas where they play on the court. Because if Maccabi had brought in Colson, let's say, instead of Brist, I would say okay, Colson is Brist with a better and more consistent shot. A bit less defense, but basically the same player. But with this formula, they can play here with any of the other 2 forwards, 3 forwards, who are currently listed here on the screen at the forward positions, and they won't get in each other's way. I think Maccabi Tel Aviv has an excellent roster of forwards, really at the highest level of the EuroLeague. I can't say the same thing about their depth at the center and guard positions. And I'm saying this because right now we know what Maccabi Tel Aviv is gonna get, mainly from one center that I personally rate very highly, and that's Daniel Theis. In my opinion, he's a perfect fit at center. Tough, smart, rose to the basket the right way. He plays the right way, and in my opinion, he's also a player who really fits the style of guards that Maccabi Tel Aviv has. For European basketball, I think he's the complete package, because he's a player who knows how to roll well after the pick and roll. He sets the pick properly, which is something that's underrated.
I hate centers who roll too early just to get their less efficient mid-range shots. He almost always sees the play through. It's a matter of fundamentals, and beyond that, he also has the ability to shoot from beyond the arc. Last year, not so efficiently at the EuroLeague level,
27%. But he's about a 33% shooter at the NBA level throughout his career. And Maccabi Tel Aviv won't need him to shoot 4 or 5 threes per game, but rather just to have the option from time to time, because he can, because he knows how. But mainly what he brings, in my opinion, is toughness and intelligence, because a lot of times people look at players and ask, wait, does he have the legs to defend? Doesn't he have the legs to defend? Is he a rim protector? Isn't he a rim protector? He has a lot of things in his game that anyone who watches him play immediately understands. These are things you can't teach or quantify just by numbers. It's no coincidence he played so many years in the NBA, and personally, I really respect him a lot. Like I said, in my opinion, it's the little things that make the difference. To give you the proper screen and then roll hard all the way out of the pick and roll. Things that might seem trivial, but they're really not. Not every player does them properly and all the way, so I really respect him a lot. But what's the downside? What's the problematic part here? The problematic part is that first, he's not getting any younger. He's 34, but that's manageable. But the way Monaco dealt with it was by letting him play around 20 minutes, both in the EuroLeague and in the league. There were other centers alongside him who shared the load and split the minutes. So here he has Sokin. And Sokin is a completely different player. And in addition, there are 2 more centers who are unproven, to say the least. After all, Daniel Theis ultimately won't be able to play 30 or 30-something minutes at the EuroLeague level right now. And here Maccabi Tel Aviv is putting a lot of chips on Armando Baico Jr., who played last year at Fenerbahce. And the problem is that we still haven't seen him play enough at the EuroLeague level. Now, don't get me wrong, it could very well be that the center is a steal, because first of all, he is 208, moves his feet well, and finishes well at the rim. On the face of it, he has very good potential, and it could be that Maccabi Tel Aviv hit the mark with him. It's not for nothing that he got to Fenerbahce, and it's not for nothing that a player spends 5 years at North Carolina, which is a top college when it comes to fundamentals and so on. But last year, he played only 26 games, averaging 10 minutes in the EuroLeague. And we're talking here about a very small sample size in terms of his experience, both in the Turkish league and in the EuroLeague itself. He's the kind of player who can definitely be a diamond in the rough, and Maccabi Tel Aviv will develop him. The question is, at this stage, will that make Maccabi Tel Aviv competitive? Will he now be able to play 20 minutes per game on average in the EuroLeague and be a quality, good player? Because Maccabi Tel Aviv will need that backup for Daniel Theis. After all, what's going on with Daniel Theis? No matter how good a center he is, he's already 34, 35. Because if he gets injured, who fills in as the center for Maccabi Tel Aviv? Sokin, and who else? Shane Hunter, who also isn't proven. And here comes one of the more worrying things about Bacot. Last year, he tended to get into foul trouble for no real reason. He would have 2 fouls on average per game in just 10 minutes of play, and that says a lot. That's 6 fouls in 30 minutes. Some of them are completely unnecessary fouls that end up being very costly. Really, sometimes there are fouls where you just say, we talked about Daniel Theis, we said basketball IQ. You either have it or you don't. The question is, does he have it? There's probably a reason why last year at Fenerbahce, when at the beginning of the season, he got about 15 to 20 minutes per game, and gradually his minutes dropped to just under 10. So that leaves us in the front court with Bacot, with Daniel Theis, who I said is top tier in my opinion. Bacot a big question mark. And another big question mark is Shane Hunter, who, to be honest, I don't know how to interpret his performance or his stats in the Polish League or in the BCL. He played at Warsaw last year, and to be honest, I don't know what the level of the Polish League is and how to measure it. In the BCL, in 6 games, he finished with just under 9 points and 6.5 rebounds. In the league, he finished with 9 points and 9.5 rebounds in the Polish League. Is that something Maccabi Tel Aviv can rely on? I have my doubts right now. And with everything I've said here, I still think Maccabi Tel Aviv's roster is actually better than last year's. I think the team has improved, it's better in terms of its potential, and if I have to rank it right now in the EuroLeague, I'd say that in the best case scenario in terms of power ranking, I'd put them in 6th or 7th place, but even here I'm giving them a bit of extra credit. Let's say that if Maccabi Tel Aviv somehow plays at home this year, definitely they can be there. Wait, I'll put them between 6th and 11th place. Somewhere in that range. A playing team, a team that is definitely quality, with clear weaknesses like almost every team in the EuroLeague, with players who are question marks, and if just 2 of them turn into legitimate EuroLeague players, this team can make a really strong run. And from here, we move on to our representative in the Euro Cup, Hapoel Jerusalem, who brought in some very interesting forwards and centers in my opinion, and I'll start with one of the most colorful players out there, which is Kelly Lofton Jr. And although this guy hasn't played in Europe until now, he does have a bit of NBA experience, and mainly he's a proven scorer at every level below the NBA. A very, very talented player who doesn't rely on athleticism but on pure skill. He's a scoring machine in the paint, and more than anything, what sets him apart, beyond the fact that he can score both from outside and inside, is his ability to pass. And don't get me wrong, he passes a lot and also turns the ball over a lot compared to how much he handles the ball and the number of passes he makes, but he definitely has that ability in his arsenal. He's not just some big guy under the basket who gets the ball and pounds it inside. He can do that. But he also has a lot of skill, and even though people joke about him being chubby, he still manages to be effective offensively. Now, he did this of course in the G League. He was looking for his opportunity at the NBA level, but he didn't really get it, and I can totally understand why, because of the physical limitations, since he's not tall enough. He's kind of a short 5 who gets forced to play as a 4, and he's not tall enough to handle the biggest guys and not quick enough to guard a modern 4. He doesn't shoot well enough from outside on a consistent basis. In the last 2 years, he's played in China. But this is a player who every minute is on the court makes his impact offensively, and if Hapoel Jerusalem knows how to use him correctly during the minutes he's on the court, also giving him the ball in the right spot so he can create offense on his own or start the play. And if they know how to cover for him defensively, they've got themselves an incredible wildcard here. This is a player who could be a real game changer and turn their season around if they know how to use him right. But to be honest, that's a big if, because at the end of the day, Kenny Lofton Jr. is an offensive asset, and we all understand he can score points and do it quickly. But the question is on the defensive end, how do you cover for him? It's clear to us that in Europe, they specifically try to target him and his heavy legs, and the fact that, as we said, he's not tall enough to guard centers and not quick enough to guard players at the base pair, 3 or 4 positions. That could create a lot of defensive problems for Hapoel Jerusalem. At the Eurocup level, I'm more than convinced that will be enough. What I'm not sure will be enough, or let's say depends more on what is expected from him, is David Roddy, who also came from the NBA, the 23rd pick in the 2022 draft. He arrives at age 25 after not managing to make an impact in the NBA. It should be said, over the years, he was a role player and couldn't produce the kind of consistency in shooting that would keep him on any team. From the moment he was drafted, he got opportunities, but gradually, those opportunities decreased and faded away. And although you see him here in the highlights making some threes, his big problem was consistency from 3, because he was actually not a bad slasher at all, especially considering his size. He also has a very big body and frame. But for a player who mainly plays off the ball, being stuck at 30% from beyond the arc for his career is problematic. Now it's possible that he could become a more effective player when the ball is in his hands more, and maybe that's also what Hapoel Jerusalem is expecting from him. If you want, the prototype is maybe similar to what Anthony Lamb was supposed to bring last year, but right now he reminds me more of Ish Wainwright than Anthony Lamb. There are a few questions here. The first is of course the issue of weight, and the second is whether Hapoel Jerusalem saw something in the slashing ability he showed, glimpses of it at the NBA level, and believe he can do that in Europe as well. That's a question mark, because right now Hapoel Jerusalem doesn't have any forward who knows how to create off the dribble, and maybe he'll fill that role. If they're counting on him just for his shooting, I don't think that's going to work. And if you look at him the way I think they see him, as a 3, since Kenny Lofton plays more with a 4 and 5, then yes, he's the player who can put the ball on the floor along with Zusman at the 3 position on this team. And here the question of weight comes up again, because he's a very hefty guy, and they need to make sure that both he and Kenny Lofton are under some kind of regimen so they don't let themselves go. Because again, we're talking about 2 players who could be a defensive liability, very heavy on defense. Now, David Roddy is a player who does try. I know I have seen him play quite a bit in the NBA. He tries to defend, but he can't always do it. And in terms of centers, Hapoel Jerusalem went with 2 very different centers. The first is Devontae Kakok, who played this year in the Spanish League for Murcia, and is a center who, even though you see him here jumping pretty well, mostly plays under the basket. What do I mean? He's a relatively short center, 2.01 meters, according to the official records, and you won't really see him jumping for impressive blocks too often. He really wants to block shots, especially as a center or a power forward depending on how you look at it, but he's not a rim protector in any way. Even when he does block shots, he usually gets those blocks while he's still on the ground, not up high but down low, as you can see right now in the video. Also on offense, he scores his points with good skills and touch around the rim, but most of the time he doesn't really play as a classic 5, let's put it that way. So Jerusalem is getting a player here who is powerful in terms of physicality, but he's not as dominant as the really big centers in Europe. On offense, like I said, he mainly relies on his offensive touch. He doesn't shoot threes, all his shots are 2-pointers. Bottom line, he's a very limited center in terms of what he knows how to do and his physical abilities, but I'm not necessarily saying that as a bad thing. There are very specific things he knows how to do, and what he doesn't know how to do, he doesn't try to do. What's more concerning is the fact that he's really not a rim protector, and that's something they try to get from Dusan Miltic, who comes after playing a few games now in Lebanon, kind of as a side gig before he arrived at Hapoel Jerusalem. He played last season in Romania and also in the Eurocup, and he's a tall, talented Serbian center, supposed to be the team's rim protector as well, apparently. And what I like even more about this pairing is that usually when there's a Serbian coach insisting on a Serbian player, he probably knows why. So this is also a player who's supposed to complete the front line of Hapoel Jerusalem together with Kakok, and there are also unconfirmed rumors that he can occasionally hit a 3-pointer. You can see his percentages here, but from what I've seen, it's at a very low volume, not something you can rely on, and I don't think he would want to rely on it either. But he did show that he's a good and effective rebounder, both on defense and offense, and Hapoel Jerusalem needed this big man. And here is the big man they need, and we also see that he did put up Eurocup level numbers last year. 12.5 points, 7.5 rebounds, over 2 assists, 2.3, more than 1 block per game in 22 minutes of play. He's effective on both ends of the floor, and it's always the fundamentals and the little things, but they're very important. Things that Serbian players have, like catching the ball and not bringing it down after he rolls, after the pass from the guard. Things that show you this is a player with fundamentals. I don't think he'll necessarily be some huge difference maker, but he's a player who can fit well with the coach, and that's often much more important than just statistics, like fitting into the system. We've seen this so many times in basketball. I think the three main teams we have in Israeli basketball that are going to compete in the EuroLeague, EuroCup and Euro Challenge will each significantly strengthen, and I also think the expectations for each of them are to have a better season on the European level, first and foremost, compared to what they had last year. And that's a high standard for Hapoel Tel Aviv. It's a standard that Maccabi Tel Aviv wants to get back to, and hopefully Hapoel Jerusalem will also succeed in doing it and win the EuroCup. Even though the EuroCup is very tough and very crowded, I don't think they're favorites, especially because there's no home advantage and so on. But they do have a roster that can pose a real threat and go all the way. And as I said before about Hapoel and Maccabi Tel Aviv, the fact that they currently have a relatively thin roster without many players doesn't mean that more players can't join later in the season. So leave a like, guys, subscribe to the channel, and on the screen you have the EuroLeague game that we're about to release very soon, Tesha Fantasy. The link will be below and soon it will be available to everyone, just before the start of the upcoming EuroLeague season. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Israel Chai. See you. Bye.